Daniel has something he'd like to share, my daughter-in-law announced, lifting her champagne glass before my husband even had the chance to stand. The room fell quiet in a way that didn't feel celebratory. It felt staged. I remember noticing the way the candlelight reflected off the crystal chandeliers we had rented for the occasion, scattering soft gold across the faces of friends who had watched our marriage grow for over 4 decades. Our 50th anniversary party was supposed to be a night of gratitude, of laughter, of stories told too loudly over slices of buttercream cake. Instead, it became the moment my life split cleanly in two. Daniel cleared his throat, adjusting the cufflinks I had given him that morning. He did not look at me. He looked at the guests. Margaret and I have shared many years together, he began, his voice smooth, rehearsed. But sometimes people grow apart. Tonight I want to be honest. I've decided to file for divorce. The word hovered in the air like a misplaced decoration. Divorce. At our anniversary party, a few nervous chuckles rippled across the room, as if someone expected him to follow up with a joke. He didn't. Someone set down a fork too loudly. Somewhere near the bar, a glass clinked against another with an awkward, apologetic sound. I felt every pair of eyes shift toward me, waiting for tears, waiting for outrage, waiting for the kind of public scene that people remember for years. Instead, I smiled. It wasn't a dramatic smile. It wasn't brave or defiant. It was small, controlled. The kind of smile a woman learns after a lifetime of swallowing disappointment like bitter medicine. I lifted my own glass, the champagne tasting suddenly flat on my tongue, and said, "Well, Daniel, honesty is important. I'm glad you finally found it." That was when I saw Lauren watching me from the far corner of the room. My daughter-in-law stood half in shadow, her hand resting lightly on Michael's arm, her expression composed in a way that did not match the shock around her. She wasn't surprised. She was observing, measuring. For months, I had sensed something shifting beneath the surface of our home. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Bank statements that arrived later than usual. Daniel's sudden interest in evening walks. He never invited me to join. First, I told myself it was age, routine, the natural drifting that comes after years of shared habits. Marriage, after all, is not a straight line. It bends. It stretches. Sometimes it grows quiet. But silence has a texture, and the silence in our house had become sharp. The band resumed playing, a slow jazz number that felt wildly inappropriate now. Guests murmured to one another, forming small islands of speculation across the ballroom floor. Someone squeezed my shoulder in passing. Someone else avoided my gaze entirely. I caught my reflection in one of the tall mirrored columns and was startled by how calm I looked. My silver hair was pinned exactly as I had arranged it that afternoon. My navy silk dress fell in perfect lines. I looked like a woman attending her own celebration, not a woman being dismissed from her own life. Daniel began moving through the crowd, shaking hands, accepting sympathetic nods as though he had just announced a difficult but noble decision. I watched him with the detached curiosity of someone observing a stranger. 50 years. I thought of the tiny starter house we bought when interest rates were climbing past 10%. I thought of midnight feedings, school recitals, cross-country moves dictated by his career ambitions. I thought of every compromise filed away like old receipts in a drawer no one opens anymore. Lauren finally approached me, her heels making soft, deliberate sounds against the polished floor. "Are you all right, Margaret?" she asked, her voice gentle enough to be mistaken for concern. I studied her face, searching for the flicker of guilt I once believed lived inside people who orchestrated quiet betrayals. Instead, I saw confidence. The kind that grows when someone believes the outcome is already guaranteed. "I'm better than all right," I replied. "In fact, this might be the most honest night we've had in years." She blinked just once. A tiny crack in an otherwise flawless performance. Across the room, Daniel laughed at something Michael said, the sound too loud, too relieved. They thought this announcement would break me. They thought that by choosing the stage, the audience, the timing, they could control the story that followed. What they didn't know was that I had spent the past 12 months quietly rewriting the ending. And sometimes all it takes to stop a room, to shift the balance of power in an instant, is one detail spoken at exactly the right moment. The music never quite recovered after Daniel spoke. It continued in polite fragments, like a conversation no one wanted to finish. I remained where I was near the long table of desserts, running my finger lightly along the rim of my glass while people decided whether to approach me or pretend they needed another drink. It is fascinating how quickly loyalty rearranges itself in public spaces. A woman I had hosted for countless holiday dinners offered me a tight smile before drifting toward Daniel, her hand already extended in practiced sympathy. I did not blame her. Most people prefer to stand near the version of the story that appears strongest. Michael finally came over, his expression strained in a way that reminded me of when he was a boy caught between telling the truth and protecting someone he loved. He smelled faintly of the expensive cologne Lauren had given him last Christmas. "Mom," he said quietly, "I did not know he was going to do it like that." I studied his face, the familiar slope of his brow, the lines that had deepened around his mouth over the past few years. He had inherited Daniel's tendency to avoid discomfort by stepping around it. "Like what?" I asked gently. "Honestly," he replied, his voice almost defensive now, "in front of everyone. It was not necessary." I let his words settle between us. Necessary. As if dignity were a scheduling issue. Across the ballroom, Lauren was speaking to two of Daniel's business associates, her posture elegant, her gestures calm and reassuring. She had always possessed the rare ability to make other people feel as though they were witnessing an unfortunate but reasonable development. A story told softly becomes easier to believe. I excused myself from Michael with a light touch on his sleeve and walked toward the terrace doors. The night air greeted me with a coolness that felt almost deliberate, brushing against my bare arms like a reminder that the world continued regardless of personal catastrophe. From the terrace, the city skyline stretched in orderly lines of light. 50 years ago, Daniel and I had stood on a different balcony in a much smaller building, counting the windows we hoped one day to afford. Back then, ambition had sounded romantic. Now it sounded rehearsed. I rested my hands on the wrought iron railing and allowed my breathing to slow. Inside, the party resumed its fragile rhythm. Laughter rose in uncertain waves. A server carried a tray of untouched champagne flutes past the glass doors, his steps careful, as though sudden movement might shatter the illusion of celebration. Footsteps approached behind me. I did not need to turn to know it was Lauren. "You are handling this remarkably well," she said, her tone warm enough to be mistaken for admiration. "Some women would be devastated." I watched a taxi glide through the intersection below, its headlights cutting clean paths through the darkness. "Some women spend years preparing for conversations that never happen," I replied. "When the moment finally arrives, it can feel like relief." She was silent for a second longer than politeness required. That was when I knew she was recalculating. "Daniel has been unhappy for a long time," she continued carefully. "He deserves a chance to start over." The phrasing was interesting. Not we. Not they. Daniel. As though she were both witness and advocate. I turned then, meeting her eyes fully. In them I saw confidence layered over impatience, the subtle urgency of someone who believes timing is everything. "Everyone deserves clarity," I said, "especially when money and promises are involved." Her smile faltered just slightly. It was a beautiful smile, one that had disarmed neighbors, teachers, even bank managers over the years. But beauty does not eliminate consequences. Inside the ballroom, Daniel was searching the crowd for me now, his shoulders squared, his expression rehearsed into something resembling regret. He had expected tears. He had expected confrontation. He had not expected distance. I stepped past Lauren and re-entered the warmth of the party, feeling dozens of conversations pause mid-sentence as I crossed the polished floor. The band shifted into a brighter tune, as if sound alone could correct the evening. Daniel reached me near the center of the room, his hand hovering uncertainly at my elbow. "Margaret," he began, lowering his voice, "we should talk privately." I tilted my head, studying the man who had once memorized my coffee order, and now needed an audience to end our marriage. "Oh, we will talk," I said calmly. "But not yet. There are still guests to thank." His confusion was almost touching. For the first time that night, I saw doubt move through him like a shadow. They had chosen the stage. They had chosen the timing. What they had not chosen was the ending. And I intended to let the anticipation build just a little longer. Daniel followed me through the remainder of the evening with the careful persistence of a man who senses that control is slipping but does not yet understand how or why. I moved from table to table, thanking guests for coming, accepting their awkward compliments about the decorations, the music, the view from the terrace. Every word I spoke sounded measured, deliberate, like stepping stones placed across water. I could feel Lauren's attention trailing behind me wherever I went, the quiet weight of someone who had invested too much in a particular outcome to tolerate uncertainty. The anniversary cake stood untouched at the center of the ballroom, its white frosting piped into delicate roses that had taken the pastry chef 3 hours to perfect. 50 years represented in tears and sugar and fragile symmetry. I remembered standing in the tasting room weeks earlier, sampling vanilla and almond and lemon while Daniel checked his phone between bites. He had said he trusted my judgment. He had said this night should be exactly how I imagined it. In a way, he was right. It was exactly as I had imagined, just not in the way he believed. Michael hovered near the bar, refilling his glass more often than necessary, his laughter arriving half a second too late whenever someone tried to lighten the mood. I watched him from across the room and felt a familiar ache that had nothing to do with betrayal and everything to do with distance. Children grow into their own loyalties. They build new homes inside new narratives. Sometimes, without realizing it, they lock the door behind them. A former neighbor approached me with bright, nervous energy, whispering that she admired my strength. Strength is an interesting word. People use it when they cannot name the colder qualities they are witnessing. Composure, calculation, resolve. The bandleader announced a slow dance, his voice cheerful in a way that bordered on defiant. Couples began to drift toward the dance floor, grateful for instructions that did not involve choosing sides. Daniel extended his hand toward me, perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of desperation to restore a familiar picture for the watching crowd. I looked at his hand for a long moment. The veins were more pronounced now, the skin thinner than when he first slipped a ring onto my finger in a small church that smelled of polished wood and carnations. "We should give them what they came for," he murmured, attempting a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. I placed my hand in his. The room seemed to exhale as we stepped onto the dance floor, as if the simple choreography of movement could mend what words had already fractured. His palm was warm, his grip steady, but there was tension in the way he guided me, a subtle insistence on leading that I had not noticed in years. We moved in slow circles beneath the chandelier light while conversations resumed around us in hushed, speculative tones. "You are making this harder than it needs to be," he said quietly. "If you cooperate, everything can be settled quickly. The lawyers have already prepared most of the paperwork." I smiled again, the same small, controlled smile that had unsettled him earlier. "Paperwork has a way of revealing who has been paying attention," I replied. He frowned, his steps faltering for a fraction of a second before he recovered the rhythm. Across the dance floor, Lauren was speaking into her phone, her back turned slightly, her voice low but urgent. I recognized that posture. I had seen it over the past year during family dinners, during holiday gatherings, during quiet afternoons when she believed I was resting upstairs. There had always been another conversation happening just out of reach. Another plan unfolding beneath polite exchanges about weather and recipes and school schedules. The music swelled, strings rising in a sentimental crescendo that might have felt romantic on any other night. Daniel drew me closer, perhaps to maintain the illusion, perhaps to search my face for the panic he expected to find. Instead he found calm. "What are you not telling me?" he asked under his breath. I let the question hang between us like a suspended note. Around us, guests watched with renewed curiosity, sensing that something more than nostalgia was unfolding in the careful space between our steps. "There is a reason I chose this venue," I said finally. "There is a reason I insisted on tonight. Timing matters, Daniel. You taught me that." His expression shifted then, confidence giving way to something sharper, more uncertain. For the first time since he had made his announcement, he was no longer performing for the room. He was listening. And sometimes the quietest part of a story is the moment just before everything changes. The dance ended without applause. It simply dissolved like a promise no one remembered making. Daniel released my hand with a politeness that felt almost ceremonial, and for a moment we stood facing one another in the soft spill of chandelier light, surrounded by conversations that pretended not to be about us. I could see the question forming again behind his eyes, the growing realization that he had misjudged the balance of power in a room he believed he controlled. I left the dance floor before he could speak, moving toward the far end of the ballroom where the tall windows framed the dark sweep of the river. Nights like this used to make me nostalgic. Now they made me attentive. A memory surfaced with the clarity of something long prepared. Nearly a year ago, I had been sitting at our kitchen table early on a Sunday morning, the smell of burnt toast still lingering in the air because Daniel had forgotten to reset the timer. He had been distracted more often then, his mind wandering during conversations, his phone face down beside his coffee like a secret he believed I would never think to question. That was the morning I first noticed the envelope. It was tucked between utility bills and glossy charity mailers, the return address printed in small, efficient type from a law firm I did not recognize. I remember turning it over in my hands, feeling the weight of paper that was too formal to be casual and too deliberate to be accidental. When I asked Daniel about it later, he had laughed lightly and said it was nothing more than routine estate planning. People our age needed to stay organized. I had nodded. I had agreed. Organization was something I understood well. Over the following months, small changes began to accumulate like dust in corners no one bothered to clean. Our joint savings account required a new signature for withdrawals above $5,000. Daniel started scheduling appointments in the city on days he had once reserved for gardening or visiting friends. Lauren began appearing at our house more frequently, always with an explanation that sounded helpful on the surface. She would bring takeout containers I had not requested or offered to handle errands I had managed perfectly well for decades. First, I welcomed the assistance. Aging teaches you to accept kindness, even when it arrives wrapped in unfamiliar gestures. But kindness has a rhythm and hers was too precise. I noticed how she lingered in Daniel's study when she thought I was upstairs. I noticed how Michael's visits became shorter, his conversations more cautious, as if he had been instructed to avoid certain topics. The realization did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, piece by piece, until the picture was impossible to ignore. I began paying closer attention. I reread bank statements. I scheduled my own appointments, quietly consulting professionals who spoke in measured tones about trusts and asset transfers and the importance of timing. They did not ask why I suddenly needed to understand every clause of a document I had once trusted my husband to explain. Perhaps they had seen this story before. Perhaps they recognized the look of someone who had decided that ignorance was no longer an option. Inside the ballroom, a server approached with a tray of coffee cups, the scent rich and grounding. I accepted one and held it between my palms, letting the warmth settle my thoughts. Across the room, Lauren was whispering to Daniel now, her expression tight, her composure beginning to fray at the edges. He listened with increasing impatience, glancing toward me as if I were a puzzle he could still solve if given enough time. They were trying to understand what I had already learned months ago. Plans built on secrecy depend on the assumption that the other person will remain predictable, that she will remain grateful, that she will remain silent. I took a slow sip of coffee and allowed myself the smallest trace of satisfaction. The anniversary party had never been about celebrating the past. It had been about choosing the perfect stage for a truth that required witnesses. And as the night moved steadily toward its inevitable conclusion, I could feel the final pieces sliding into place, each one carrying the quiet certainty of a woman who had waited long enough. By the time the clock above the bar struck 9, the party had settled into a strange imitation of normalcy. People laughed too loudly at harmless stories. They refilled glasses they did not want. They lingered near the exits as if measuring how much longer courtesy required them to stay. I moved through the room with deliberate ease, aware that every step I took was being observed, interpreted, discussed in hushed voices that traveled faster than the music. Daniel had retreated to a small circle of acquaintances, who nodded gravely at whatever version of events he was offering them. I could almost hear the phrases without standing close enough to listen. Growing apart. Difficult decision. Mutual understanding. Words polished smooth by repetition. Lauren remained near him like a quiet advisor, her hand occasionally brushing his sleeve in gestures that appeared supportive but felt rehearsed. I wondered how many evenings they had spent constructing this narrative, How many drafts it had taken to make betrayal sound reasonable. A server passed with a tray of sliced cake, the delicate layers finally exposed after hours of being admired. I accepted a plate and held the fork without eating. Celebrations are often defined by what people consume. Tonight was defined by what they avoided. Michael approached again, his expression softer now, tinged with something that might have been guilt or confusion or both. "Mom, maybe you should go home," he suggested carefully. "You do not have to stay here for this." I studied him for a long moment, seeing the boy who once insisted on holding my hand while crossing busy streets, now unsure how to guide me across emotional ones. "This is my home tonight," I replied. "I planned every detail. It would be rude to leave before the ending." He looked startled by the certainty in my voice. Across the room, Daniel noticed our conversation and began making his way toward us, his posture straightening as though preparing for negotiation. Lauren followed half a step behind, her smile returning with practiced precision. Timing, I thought again. Everything in life depends on timing. Nearly 6 months earlier, I had sat in a quiet office overlooking a parking lot where faded white lines marked spaces no one seemed eager to claim. The attorney across from me had spoken slowly, explaining clauses and contingencies while sliding documents across a polished desk. I had listened without interrupting, asking only the questions that mattered. What happens if assets are transferred without mutual consent? What protections exist when long-standing agreements are altered in secret? How long does it take to reverse decisions made under the assumption that one party will never notice? He had answered each inquiry with professional clarity, occasionally studying my face as if searching for signs of distress. He did not find any. Preparation rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It resembles routine. It resembles patience. Back in the ballroom, Daniel stopped just short of touching my arm, perhaps remembering the way I had withdrawn earlier. "Margaret, we should finalize this tonight," he said, lowering his voice as though urgency could be disguised as practicality. "There is no reason to drag things out. The paperwork is ready. We can divide everything fairly." The word fairly lingered between us like a fragile ornament. Lauren watched my reaction with open concentration now, no longer bothering to hide her investment in the outcome. Around us, guests pretended to admire the floral arrangements while leaning closer to catch every syllable. I set my untouched plate of cake on the nearest table and smoothed the front of my dress, a simple gesture that allowed the silence to stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable. "You are right," I said at last. "There is no reason to drag things out." Relief flickered across Daniel's features so quickly it might have been mistaken for affection. Lauren exhaled almost imperceptibly. They believed the moment had arrived exactly as they had planned it. They believed the stage belonged to them. What they did not understand was that preparation changes a person. It teaches her to wait for the precise second when certainty becomes vulnerability. I reached into my evening bag, feeling the reassuring weight of folded paper beneath my fingertips, and allowed myself the smallest hint of a smile that was no longer controlled but quietly victorious. The silence after I touched my evening bag was not immediate. It grew slowly, like the dimming of lights before a performance begins. Daniel noticed the movement first. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in concentration, as though he were trying to remember a detail he had once overlooked. Lauren's gaze followed his, sharp and unwavering now, stripped of all polite pretense. Around us, conversations began to falter one by one. The band, sensing the shift in energy that only comes from human tension, lowered their volume until the piano became little more than a distant heartbeat. I withdrew the folded documents with care, smoothing the edges against my palm as if they were nothing more significant than a dinner receipt. Preparation teaches you that power often arrives disguised as paper. "You mentioned fairness," I said quietly, allowing my voice to carry just enough to reach the curious listeners hovering nearby. "It is an interesting word. It implies balance, transparency, consent." Daniel's expression hardened, the relief he had shown moments earlier evaporating into something defensive. "Margaret, this is not the time," he replied, attempting to reclaim control with a firmness that sounded rehearsed. "We can discuss legal matters privately." I tilted my head, studying him with the detached patience I had cultivated over the past year. "You chose the time," I reminded him gently. You chose the audience. I am simply honoring your decision. A ripple of unease moved through the room. Someone set down a glass with a soft click that seemed louder than it should have been. Michael stepped closer, his confusion deepening into concern as he glanced between us. Lauren, however, did not move. She stood perfectly still, as if instinct told her that any sudden motion might accelerate an outcome she was no longer certain she could influence. Months earlier, in that quiet office overlooking the faded parking lot, the attorney had explained the concept of conditional transfer in measured terms. Assets moved without proper disclosure could be challenged. Agreements signed under incomplete information could be reversed. Timing, he had said again and again, was not simply strategy. It was protection. I had listened, memorizing every phrase the way one memorizes emergency instructions on an airplane. You hope never to need them. You prepare anyway. Back in the ballroom, Daniel extended his hand toward the papers, perhaps hoping to intercept whatever narrative I was about to introduce. I did not give them to him. Instead, I held them at my side and allowed the suspense to stretch, feeling the collective attention of our guests settle like a physical weight against my shoulders. It did not frighten me. It steadied me. For the past year, I continued, there have been changes. New accounts. Revised titles. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. I told myself these were coincidences. That loyalty had simply grown quieter with age. Daniel's jaw tightened. Lauren's composure finally flickered. A brief flash of calculation breaking through the calm she had worn like jewelry all evening. Michael whispered my name, a plea for explanation that I could not yet grant him. There is a moment in every carefully planned reveal when silence becomes the loudest force in the room. I let that moment expand until even the band had stopped pretending to play. The chandeliers hummed faintly overhead. Somewhere near the entrance, the elevator doors opened and closed with a mechanical sigh that sounded like the end of an era. I unfolded the top sheet slowly, deliberately, making sure the crisp sound of paper carried across polished floors and anxious expressions. You prepared documents, I said, meeting Daniel's eyes. So did I. His confidence faltered then, replaced by something far more revealing than anger. Uncertainty. Lauren took a step forward at last, her voice carefully neutral as she asked what exactly I meant. I smiled, not with restraint this time, but with the quiet assurance of someone who has waded through every stage of doubt and arrived at clarity. They had believed preparation belonged only to them. They had believed secrecy was a one-sided privilege. What they had never considered was that patience, once awakened, becomes its own form of strength. And strength, when revealed at precisely the right second, does not need to shout to be heard. The sound of paper unfolding seemed louder than any announcement Daniel had made that night. It carried across the ballroom with a crisp certainty that cut through speculation and polite disbelief. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. Attention had already settled on me with the quiet inevitability of gravity. Daniel's hand hovered midair, as if he were still deciding whether reaching for the documents would restore the version of control he had rehearsed. Lauren stood beside him now, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, yet the distance between them felt suddenly complicated. I let my eyes move slowly across the room before speaking again, acknowledging the witnesses without directly inviting their judgment. 6 months ago, I said calmly, a revision was filed regarding the primary assets associated with our marriage. New ownership pathways. Conditional transfers. A timeline that assumed I would remain uninformed. A murmur moved through the guests like a change in weather. Someone near the back whispered a name. Someone else pretended to study the ceiling lights with great interest. Daniel finally found his voice. Margaret, you are misunderstanding the situation, he said, each word placed carefully. Like stones in a path he hoped would lead him out of danger. These are standard adjustments. Our attorney recommended them. I nodded once, acknowledging the familiarity of that explanation. Yes, I replied. An attorney was involved. Several, actually. Lauren's composure thinned further. She stepped forward with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to influencing outcomes before they fully materialize. There is no need to make this public, she said, her tone still courteous but edged now with urgency. We can clarify everything privately. I met her gaze without hostility, without accusation, simply with the steady awareness of a woman who had spent long nights assembling truth from fragments. Privacy, I said softly, is valuable, but so is accuracy. I lifted the top page just high enough for Daniel to recognize the letterhead. Recognition moved across his face in stages. First confusion, then disbelief. Finally, the unmistakable flicker of alarm. It was a law firm he knew well. Not the one he had chosen. The one he had underestimated. Months earlier, when I had first sensed the shift beneath our shared routines, I had begun cataloging details with quiet discipline. Dates of withdrawals. Copies of correspondence left too casually within reach. Conversations overheard through half-closed doors. I had not confronted him then. Confrontation is often mistaken for strength. Preparation is something else entirely. Michael spoke my name again, this time louder, his voice carrying a mixture of fear and hope that made my heart tighten despite everything. I placed my hand lightly over his for a brief second, a reassurance I could not fully explain. Then I continued. The revision you initiated, I said to Daniel, contained a clause that depended on my signature. A clause you believed would be obtained under the assumption of routine documentation. But the timing was incorrect. The disclosure incomplete. The room seemed to lean closer. Even the servers had paused their quiet circulation, trays suspended like unanswered questions. Daniel swallowed, his certainty unraveling thread by thread. Lauren's eyes darted toward him, then back to me, calculating possibilities that were shrinking by the second. I unfolded another sheet, allowing the crispness of the paper to underline the inevitability of what came next. 2 weeks after your filing, I said evenly, I submitted a protective amendment. One that freezes any transfer lacking full transparency. One that ensures every asset associated with our marriage remains jointly accountable until a formal review is completed. The words were not dramatic. They did not need to be. Their power lay in precision. A collective intake of breath moved through the ballroom, followed by a silence so complete it felt almost sacred. Daniel stared at the documents as though they might rearrange themselves if he waited long enough. Lauren's posture finally lost its effortless symmetry, her shoulders tightening in a way no amount of social training could conceal. In that moment I understood something with absolute clarity. Betrayal thrives on assumption. It grows in the quiet spaces where one person believes the other will never learn to listen differently. I folded the papers once more and returned them to my evening bag, not as a gesture of retreat, but as a confirmation that the reveal had already done its work. Around us, the party no longer resembled a celebration or a spectacle. It had become something far more honest. A room full of witnesses to the instant when certainty changed hands without a single raised voice. The silence did not break all at once. It fractured slowly, like ice giving way beneath careful footsteps. A woman near the buffet table cleared her throat and immediately pretended she had something caught there. Someone else laughed too brightly at nothing in particular. The band members exchanged uncertain glances, their instruments resting idle in their hands as if music itself had decided to wait. Daniel did not move. He stood facing me with the stillness of a man who had just discovered that certainty can dissolve in public. His lips parted once, then closed again, the argument he had prepared no longer fitting the reality unfolding around him. Lauren was the first to recover enough to speak. There must be some misunderstanding, she said, her voice measured but no longer smooth. Legal processes can be complicated. Perhaps the documents were filed incorrectly. I watched her carefully. For the first time that evening, she sounded less like an architect and more like a witness to something she could not redesign. No, irraplia gently. They were filed exactly as intended. Michael stepped forward, his gaze moving between his father and me as though searching for a bridge that had quietly vanished. Mom, what does this mean? He asked, his voice low but carrying in the heavy quiet. I rested my hand briefly against his arm, feeling the tension there, the instinct to protect colliding with the need to understand. It means that decisions made in secrecy have consequences, I said. And that assumptions can be very expensive. A ripple of whispers moved through the room again, no longer polite or restrained. Words like assets and freeze and review floated through the air, detached from context yet loaded with implication. Daniel finally spoke, his voice rougher now, stripped of the confident cadence he had used earlier. You went behind my back, he said. It was not an accusation shouted in anger. It was a realization spoken in disbelief. I considered the phrase for a moment. I went beside you, I answered. You simply did not notice. Lauren's posture shifted subtly, her shoulders drawing inward as though recalculating her role in a narrative that had begun to tilt away from her control. She reached for Daniel's sleeve again, but this time the gesture lacked its earlier assurance. Around us, guests who had once admired our partnership now studied us with the detached curiosity reserved for stories that will be retold later over breakfast tables and quiet phone calls. The chandeliers hummed softly overhead, their light revealing every flicker of uncertainty, every tightening jaw, every glance exchanged too quickly to be accidental. I became aware of how steady my breathing felt, how grounded my feet seemed against the polished floor. Months of preparation had not only protected assets, they had reshaped my understanding of fear. It is difficult to be intimidated by a moment you have already rehearsed in your mind 100 times. A server resumed moving through the crowd, offering coffee with a professionalism that bordered on heroic. Cups were accepted gratefully, hands needing something to hold. Daniel ran a hand across his forehead, a gesture I had seen during difficult negotiations in his career, but never directed toward me. This does not change the fact that I want a divorce, he said finally. The statement sounded smaller now, less like a declaration and more like an attempt to reclaim territory that was no longer available. I inclined my head. Of course, I replied. Clarity goes both ways. Lauren exhaled slowly, her eyes narrowing with a mixture of frustration and reluctant respect. She had misjudged the pace of the game. She had mistaken silence for surrender. That happens often in families. We confuse kindness with ignorance. We assume endurance is the same as weakness. Somewhere near the entrance, the elevator chimed again, its metallic note strangely comforting in its ordinariness. Life outside this ballroom continued without pause. Inside, however, something irreversible had shifted. I could feel it in the way people now looked at Daniel, at Lauren, at me. The story they had expected to witness had been rewritten in real time. I reached for my glass of champagne, now warm and nearly flat, and took a small sip anyway. Celebration is not always about joy. Sometimes it is about recognition. And recognition, once achieved, carries a quiet power that no announcement can erase. Daniel did not argue again. That was the first sign that the evening had reached its true conclusion. Instead, he stood very still, as though movement itself might confirm a reality he was not yet ready to accept. Lauren's hand slipped away from his sleeve, not dramatically, not even consciously perhaps, but with the quiet instinct of someone who understands when a partnership has shifted from advantage to liability. Around us, conversations resumed in cautious fragments, like guests testing the safety of thin ice. I became aware of the faint scent of coffee and sugar lingering in the air, of the distant hum of traffic drifting up from the streets below, of the way the chandeliers reflected in the polished floor like twin constellations that had lost their meaning. Michael remained beside me, his presence steady but uncertain, as if he were standing at the edge of a decision he did not yet know how to make. Mom, he said finally, what happens now? I considered the question with the same care I had given every decision over the past year. What happens now? For most of my life, I had believed that endings arrived like storms. Loud, immediate, impossible to ignore. But real endings are quieter. They unfold in measured steps, in documents signed at the right time, in truths revealed without anger. Now, I said softly, we move forward. Separately. Clearly. Daniel exhaled then, a long breath that seemed to carry the weight of plans dissolving. You could have told me, he said. It was not a plea. It was a recognition of distance. I met his gaze without hostility. You stopped listening, I replied. There is a difference. Lauren turned away toward the bar, her reflection briefly captured. In one of the mirrored columns. For the first time since I had known her, she looked unsure of her next step. Confidence, I had learned, depends on predictable outcomes. When the script changes, even the most practiced performer must improvise. Guests began collecting their coats, offering polite farewells that sounded sincere enough to preserve dignity, but distant enough to signal that the evening would be discussed later in safer spaces. A woman who had danced at our wedding decades ago hugged me with unexpected firmness. A former colleague of Daniel's nodded at me with something that resembled respect. These small gestures did not feel like victories. They felt like acknowledgments. I walked slowly toward the terrace doors one last time, needing the cool air to confirm that the night was real and not simply the final act of a story I had rehearsed too often in my mind. The city lights shimmered across the river in long broken lines. Somewhere below, a car horn sounded sharp and impatient, reminding me that time continues regardless of personal revelations. Daniel joined me after a moment, keeping a careful distance as though proximity itself had become uncertain ground. "We will still have to divide everything," he said. I nodded. "Yes," I answered. "But we will do it honestly." The word lingered between us, stripped now of performance, reduced to its essential meaning. Behind us, Michael and Lauren spoke in low voices I chose not to overhear. Some conversations belonged to the people who must live with their consequences. I reached into my evening bag and felt the folded documents once more. Not out of necessity but out of habit. The way one touches a scar to remember the lesson it represents. 50 years had not been erased in a single night. They had simply been redefined. I turned back toward the ballroom, now half empty, the anniversary cake reduced to scattered crumbs and abandoned forks. Celebration leaves evidence. So does revelation. Without announcing my departure, without seeking permission or applause, I walked toward the exit, my steps steady, my reflection moving ahead of me in the mirrored walls like a guide I had finally learned to trust. I did not feel like a woman who had lost a husband. I felt like a woman who had regained herself.